Is this some kind of joke? The voice was slick with the kind of manufactured confidence that comes from expensive sunglasses and a belief that the world is a stage for your own amusement. Brent, the range instructor for the day, gestured with a dismissive flick of his wrist toward the old man standing quietly by the equipment benches. "Sir, this is a live fire range, not a retirement home. You might want to find the shuffleboard tournament." A few sycophantic chuckles rippled through the group of tech executives Brent was hosting, men whose soft hands had never known a callus and whose idea of a challenge was a poor quarterly earnings report. The old man didn't react. He simply stood there, a pillar of stillness in the swirling dust of the high desert range. He wore a simple, faded flannel shirt, worn khaki trousers, and dark glasses that hid his eyes. One hand rested on the worn handle of a white cane, the tip tapping a silent, patient rhythm against the concrete. His daughter, a woman in her 40s with worry etched into the lines around her eyes, stepped forward. "He's with me. We're just here for the charity event. He likes the fresh air." Brent smirked, his eyes sweeping over the old man's unimpressive frame. "The air's full of lead, ma'am. Not exactly therapeutic." The old man, Samuel, finally turned his head, not toward Brent, but in the general direction of the distant targets, 1,000 yards away, shimmering like mirages in the brutal afternoon sun. The disrespect was a physical thing, a foul taste in the air that mixed with the sharp scent of cordite and hot metal. Brent, sensing he had a captive audience, decided to amplify his cruel theater. He swaggered over to a large black pelican case sitting on its own designated table, a centerpiece for the event. "All right, folks," he announced, his voice booming with false authority. "What we have here is something special, fresh from a private collector." He unlatched the case with a dramatic flair, revealing not a complete firearm, but a jumble of precisely machined parts nestled in custom-cut foam. The metal was a dark, matte gray, the pieces unfamiliar and vaguely sinister. "This is a Russian OSV-96, a 12.7mm anti-materiel sniper rifle. A real beast. You can't even get these in the States legally." He let the weight of that statement hang in the air before turning his predatory grin back on Samuel. "Hey, Grandpa," he called out. "You look like you've seen a war or two. Bet you handled a few of these in your day, right?" The laughter this time was louder, more confident. Samuel's daughter bristled, her voice sharp. "That's enough. We'll be leaving." But Samuel placed a calm, steady hand on her forearm. The pressure was gentle, yet absolute. He didn't speak a word, but his message was clear. Stay. Wait. His composure was unnerving, a deep, still reservoir in the face of a tidal wave of mockery. From across the range, Master, Sergeant Thomas Davis, watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of disgust. He was here off duty, a guest of the same charity event, trying to find a moment of peace in the familiar rhythm of gunfire. Brent and his crew of corporate hyenas were a stain on the day, their loud bragging and careless weapon handling setting his teeth on edge. He saw the cruel pantomime with the old, blind man and started moving, his intent clear, to walk over there and use his rank, even out of uniform, to shut this arrogant child down. An NCO's protective instinct was a hard thing to suppress, but as he drew closer, something made him pause. It was the old man's stance. To the untrained eye, he looked frail, perhaps a bit stooped. But Davis saw something else. His feet were shoulder-width apart, his weight perfectly balanced. It wasn't the tentative posture of the infirm. It was a modified parade rest, a stance so deeply ingrained by years of discipline that it had become his body's natural state of repose. His head, tilted slightly, wasn't just listening. It was orienting, tracking the subtle shifts in the wind and the cacophony of the range with an unnerving predatory stillness. Davis slowed his approach, his curiosity overriding his anger. Something was wrong with this picture, or rather, something was profoundly right in a way that nobody else could see. Davis was now only 20 feet away, partially concealed by a stack of ammunition crates. The laughter had died down to a low murmur of anticipation as Brent, holding one of the heavy components of the rifle, waved it in front of Samuel's face. "Want to give it a shot, old-timer? See if you can figure out which end the bullet comes out of?" Davis's eyes narrowed, scanning the old man from head to toe, looking for a sign, a tell, anything that would explain the dissonance he was feeling. He saw the worn leather of his simple boots, the faded fabric of his shirt, the deep lines on his face that spoke of a hard life. And then he saw it. Peeking out from just under the cuff of the man's left sleeve was a small, faded patch of ink on his wrinkled skin. It was barely a smudge, the lines blurred by decades of sun and sweat, but Davis's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew that symbol. It was a ghost, a myth whispered about in classified debriefs and training schools for the most elite echelons of special operations. It was the insignia of a unit that technically didn't exist, a small phantom cell tasked with impossible missions deep behind enemy lines. It was a unit whose members were spoken of in the past tense, legends who had all been declared lost to the shadows they operated in. Davis felt the blood drain from his face. It couldn't be. Samuel finally moved. He took a single, deliberate step forward, his cane tapping once on the concrete. He held out his hands, palms up. They were gnarled with age, and crisscrossed with a road map of fine white scars. But they were steady. Rock. Steady. "May I?" he asked. His voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river, yet it cut through the ambient noise of the range with absolute clarity. Brent, thrown off balance by the man's sudden engagement, could only stammer for a moment before his arrogance returned. This was the punchline he'd been waiting for. The blind man was actually going to try. Yeah, be my guest," he sneered, gesturing grandly at the open case. "Knock yourself out. Just try not to drool on the merchandise." The small crowd leaned in, phones half raised to capture the impending humiliation. Samuel's daughter looked on, her face a mask of pained resignation. But Davis watched, his breath caught in his throat as Samuel's hands descended toward the jumble of foreign steel. His fingers didn't touch the parts. Not yet. They hovered an inch above the components, dancing in the air, tracing the shapes, mapping the layout with an eerie, tactile intelligence. It was the gesture of a bomb disposal expert, a surgeon, a master craftsman assessing his materials. It was the gesture of a man who could see more with his fingertips than they could with their eyes. Then, his hands dropped. What happened next was not an act of assembly. It was an act of restoration, as if the rifle parts were merely returning to their predestined form. There was no fumbling, no hesitation, no searching. It was a fluid, unbroken sequence of movements, a symphony of kinetic memory. The heavy barrel slid into the receiver with a solid, greasy thunk. The bolt carrier group was seated with a swift, efficient motion, its path traced from muscle memory, forged in 1,000 dark nights. The massive muzzle brake twisted on with a precise click-clack-click. The bipod legs snapped down. The heavy magazine, which Brent had struggled to seat earlier, was slammed home with the palm of his hand, the locking mechanism engaging with a definitive, authoritative snap. It was a blur of controlled violence, a masterpiece of economy and purpose. The snickering had long since died. The air grew thick and heavy with disbelief. The entire assembly, a process that would take a trained armorer several minutes, was completed in less than 30 seconds. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the target pulley and the whistling of the wind. Samuel racked the bolt, the sound echoing like a thunderclap in the sudden stillness, and settled the enormous rifle into the crook of his shoulder as if it were a part of him. Brent's jaw was slack, his face a pale, blotchy mess. The smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by a creeping, horrified awe. The tech executives looked at each other, their smirks frozen and forgotten. This wasn't part of the show. This was something else entirely. Samuel, holding the 10-pound rifle with an easy familiarity, cocked his head again, his face a mask of intense concentration. He was listening to the world. "The 1,000-yard steel is up, correct?" he asked, his voice unchanged, still that quiet, gravelly calm. Brent couldn't form words. He just nodded dumbly, a puppet with its strings cut. It was Davis who answered, his own voice tight with a reverence that bordered on worship. He took a step forward, out from behind the crates, his posture instinctively shifting to something more formal. "Yes, sir," he said, the honorific slipping out without thought. "The 1,000-yard target is active." Samuel gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Good." He adjusted his position slightly, settling the rifle's bipod on the edge of the wooden bench. He didn't try to find the scope with his hands. He ignored it completely. "I need a sound source," he stated, not asked. "Someone go to the target post and tap it with a hammer. A steady, repeating rhythm. One tap every 2 seconds." The request was so bizarre, so utterly alien to the principles of marksmanship, that it left the audience stunned. It was a request from a different world, a different kind of war. One of Brent's friends, a young man named Kevin who was more follower than leader, looked at his now silent mentor for guidance and found none. He looked at the impossible old man, then at the distant target. Hesitantly, as if in a dream, he picked up a small mallet from a toolkit and began the long walk downrange. The minutes stretched. Finally, a tiny figure in the distance reached the target array. A moment later, a small, rhythmic tink, tink, tink began to drift back on the wind, a fragile metronome counting time across the vast expanse of desert. Samuel closed his mouth and breathed through his nose. One deep, cleansing breath in. One long, slow breath out. His cheek was welded to the stock of the rifle. His head was angled strangely, his ear pointed slightly forward toward the sound. He was aiming with his hearing. He became perfectly still, a statue carved from patience and resolve. For a single, eternal second, the entire world seemed to hold its breath with him. Then the OSV-96 erupted with a deafening, concussive roar that shook the very ground. The muzzle flash was a blinding flower of orange and white. The massive 12.7mm round tore through the air, its passage an invisible line drawn between the old man and the horizon. An agonizing 1.5 seconds passed. Then, clear as a bell, a high, sharp, beautiful ping echoed back from the target. A perfect dead-center strike. The sound of the impact hung in the air. A final, definitive punctuation mark on a statement of impossible truth. No one moved. No one breathed. They just stared, first at the distant, vibrating steel plate, then back at the blind man who now calmly worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing with a flick of his wrist. The hot brass spun through the air and landed on the concrete with a faint, musical tinkle. Into this shocked tableau, Master Sergeant Davis strode forward. His boots crunched on the gravel with military precision. He walked past the petrified form of Brent, past the stunned executives, and stopped exactly 3 paces in front of Samuel Croft. With a motion as sharp and clean as a rifle shot, he snapped his heels together. His back went ramrod straight. He raised his right hand, fingers straight and together, and rendered the most profound, heartfelt salute of his entire 20-year career. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried the weight of history, ringing with an emotion that was equal parts awe and shame. "Sergeant Major Croft," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "it is an honor, sir." He held the salute, his eyes locked on the blind man's face. Samuel simply inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement from one warrior to another. Davis then slowly lowered his hand and turned to face the dumbstruck crowd. his face a mask of cold fury and righteous reverence. "You people," Davis began, his voice low and trembling with controlled rage, "have absolutely no idea. You stand here and you mock a man you are not worthy of cleaning the boots of. You are in the presence of a living ghost." He gestured toward Samuel. "This is Sergeant Major Samuel Croft. During his service, his call sign was Echo. He was the lead spotter and sniper for a Tier 1 unit called Project Chimera. He and his team did things you people can't even imagine in your worst nightmares, things that allow you to stand here today on this range and enjoy your comfortable lives." He took a step toward Brent, who actually flinched and shrank back. "He is blind because he took a round fragment to the face while shielding 2 members of his team from a grenade blast during an extraction that is still so classified. Most of the Pentagon doesn't know it happened." "And that shot you just witnessed?" Davis let out a short, incredulous laugh. "That was nothing. In the mountains of the Hindu Kush, he made an auditory cued shot at over the 500 meters, at night in a sandstorm, to eliminate a high-value target and save an entire platoon from being overrun. A record that will never be published. A record that is the stuff of absolute legend." The silence was now one of shame, a heavy blanket smothering the once festive atmosphere. The range owner, a portly man named Henderson, who had been drawn by the unusual silence followed by the cannon-like report of the OSV-96, came bustling over, his face pale. He had heard Davis's speech, and the implications were crashing down on him. His business, his reputation, his connection with the local veteran community, all of it was in jeopardy. "Sergeant Major," he began, his voice wheezing, "I am so sorry. I had no idea. This employee, Brent, his actions are inexcusable. He's fired." "Of course he's fired." Brent stood frozen, his face ashen, the world he had built for himself on a foundation of arrogance crumbling to dust around him. But Samuel Croft simply shook his head, a gesture that was not of forgiveness, but of dismissal. It was beneath his notice. He carefully placed the massive rifle back on the bench and turned to Davis, his hand extended. "The body forgets, but the hands remember," Samuel said, his voice softer now. "Good to know the old training still holds up, Master Sergeant." Davis took the offered hand, his own grip firm but full of a respect that was almost painful. "Sir, the records. They all said you and your team were KIA on that last op. The files were sealed. We thought you were gone." A faint, sad smile touched Samuel's lips. He turned toward his daughter, who was now openly weeping, tears of pride and sorrow streaming down her face. He gently took her arm. "The parts of me that mattered made it home, son," he said to Davis, but his gaze was distant, looking back into a past no one else could see. "That's all that counts." He didn't look back at the gawking crowd or the disgraced instructor. He didn't wait for more apologies. His moment of vindication was not in their shock, but in the quiet confirmation of his own enduring skill. "I believe you promised me a coffee, sweetheart," he said gently to his daughter. She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, and together they began to walk away from the firing line. The old warrior leaning lightly on his daughter's arm, his white cane tapping out a steady, unhurried rhythm on the path toward the parking lot. Davis watched them go, a legend disappearing back into the anonymity he had clearly chosen. He felt a profound sense of connection, a shared understanding of a world defined by sacrifice and silence. He turned back to Henderson and Brent. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Get him out of my sight," he said to the owner, his voice flat and cold as stone. Then he walked over to the bench, picked up the hot brass casing ejected from the rifle, and closed his fist around it. It was still warm. It was a souvenir, a reminder of the day he saw a ghost prove that true strength isn't in what you can show the world, but in what you carry silently within yourself, a quiet power forged in fires no one else will ever see. The real heroes, he knew, weren't the ones on the movie screens. They were the quiet old men in faded flannel shirts walking among us, their greatness hidden in plain sight.